Okay, let's get started. So, good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you're located. I'm Manuela Hartwig, project researcher at the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo, and I will be moderating this session. I welcome everyone to today's webinar and our webinar series, and I think we are starting the new year quite strongly with our speaker from Germany, Dr. Miranda Böttcher. Just to give you a small introduction about our project. So this webinar is part of our JST Social Scenario Research Project, in which we are dedicated to contribute to the advancing of a carbon neutral society in Japan. We explore potential pathways, strategies, and societal choices for shaping a desirable future. The project covers a diverse range of academic perspectives, and a central element is the social scenario research for accelerating a carbon neutral transition, which combines both qualitative and quantitative approaches to analyze carbon neutral technologies and develop practical strategies for societal adoption and system design. And in the webinar series, we invite scenario experts to share their experience and expertise and provide a platform to share insights and foster dialogue aimed at expediting the transition to a carbon neutral future. So today it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Miranda Böttcher, a distinguished scholar and practitioner in global and environmental politics and foresight. Dr. Böttcher is a research associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin and an adjunct assistant professor at Utrecht University's Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development. Her research focuses on the development and legitimization of future climate policy options, particularly in the context of marine carbon removal and governance. She also serves as a review editor for the UNEP GEO7 report and is an Earth System Governance Research Fellow. Her career includes prestigious fellowships and research roles at institutions such as the University of Oxford, the University of Melbourne, and the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. And her extensive background spans foresight analysis, climate and energy policy, and sustainability research, making her an invaluable voice on social scenario research for our webinar today. So without further ado, please, Miranda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that very extensive introduction. Let me just try to share my screen. Hopefully you can see it. Wait a moment, I must switch the screens. So do you see the full screen version at the moment?
Not yet. Now we can see it. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Great. Then hi, everyone, from my side. It's early in the morning here in Berlin, and I'm very happy to be speaking to you in the evening in Tokyo. And I'm going to talk today about multi-level challenges in climate policy futures and how foresight scenarios can help think through and navigate them. So first of all, I assume that some people in the room are familiar with this, but just to recap, what is foresight? It's a tool for thinking about plausible futures in a structured way. Most often, foresight is based on exploratory qualitative scenario development processes that focus on the broader context of an issue to explore alternative futures. And exploratory foresight scenarios can help trace these complex interactions of a wide range of political, economic, technological, and social factors in a variety of hypothetical futures. So you see this future cone here on the right side of the screen. This is the idea of using qualitative foresight approaches is to expand this future cone. So not just extrapolating for the probable futures that we can most easily think about, because that's the way our brain works, but expanding the way that we think about the future to a wider range of plausible futures that may seem to us more unlikely, but are still as plausible as the probable futures that are easy to imagine. So foresight activities facilitates structured anticipatory group communication about policy futures. As I said, it widens the understandings of plausible developments based on the anticipation of interactions between a range of political, economic, technological, and social factors. And ideally, it can help us explore various policy or societal responses to deal with risks and opportunities across a range of plausible futures. just to come back to the understanding of multi-level climate policy, as you likely already know, climate policy is a really multifaceted field characterized by the interplay between domestic level, regional and international dynamics. So at the domestic level, climate policy is shaped by competing interest groups' priorities, existing legal and regulatory landscapes, and socioeconomic conditions, as well as public preferences. And domestic climate policy decision makers must balance environmental goals or climate goals with economic competitiveness, social equity, and other policy objectives, addressing the needs and concerns of a really wide range of stakeholders, including industry, civil society, local publics. Then we have on the, I'm using the German example here. We are embedded within the European Union, and on the European Union level, climate policy is governed by collective strategies and legislation aimed at achieving climate and sustainability targets. And member states, so Germany is a member of the EU, so member states' national policies are strongly influenced by and at the same time contribute to these wider EU objectives. And on the international level, climate policy is guided by the Paris Agreement under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which sets out a collective goal to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And global climate governance mechanisms are intended to facilitate coordination and accountability, ensuring that countries work together towards common climate objectives. But as we know, unfortunately, differences in stakeholder interests, different climate policy priorities and capacities in various countries around the world often hinder international cooperation and coordination. So thinking through the possible future complexities of climate policy across these levels requires a really comprehensive approach that considers the interconnections and synergies. It's quite a complex space that we have to think about. And we really think that Foresight offers a really great way to think about complex climate policy futures. And at the beginning of last year, I led my colleagues here at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs through a Foresight process designed to help us think about plausible climate policy futures in a really structured way. As I said, it's extremely complex, so we need to have tools to enable us to think through these really interconnected levels. So we asked ourselves, which factors will plausibly have a significant impact on EU climate policy or on climate policy in general between now and 2030? And today I'm not only going to tell you about the results, so the key challenges and opportunities we identified on the way towards a sustainable and just climate futures, but also how we reached them using Foresight. The idea is to give you some insight into how this methodology can help think through complex future interdependencies in multi-level climate policy. So in the first step of the scenario development process that we went through was a so-called horizon scanning. So I asked the participants to identify a broad range of geopolitical, economic, social, technological, environmental, and any other factors that they could think of. They could name as many as they liked. There was no limit and there was no predefined set of categories. So they, as many factors as they could think of that might shape climate policy development in the next 10 years or 5 until 2030. The resulting collection of factors were then clustered by the participants into larger sets of factors for the next step of the process, which you can see here. So I'm assuming this is quite small on your screen, but the process resulted in us gathering a really wide range of types of factors that could significantly affect climate policy in the next few years. So here you can see different clusters. So we sort of grouped these after the initial really wide gathering of factors into these clusters. So we have one cluster on technology advancement. So to what extent has solar energy been implemented, how much renewable energy is available, what is the access and availability of critical minerals like, what are hydrogen prices like in the future, and to what extent have other climate relevant technologies like carbon capture and storage developed. Then we have a geopolitics cluster, which is all about, to what extent are there ongoing conflicts and wars? What is the level of trust between different countries in this future world? What is the level of energy interdependence in this future world? And we have a cluster about non-climate crises that might be happening in the future. So is there an ongoing pandemic or other kinds of economic crises that might be on a global scale? Then we have a cluster about the role of emerging economies, so economic development in different large and fast-growing economies like India, Indonesia, and Nigeria, for example. Then we have a special cluster in the middle about US-China relations, because that turned up quite a lot in this exercise. So to what extent the tensions between USA and China escalating or stabilizing? Is there a decoupling between the US and China? What are trade tensions like? Is there a conflict over critical mineral exchange? And we have a cluster on international climate finance. So to what extent just energy transition partnerships working? Is there, are there financial flows between countries for the purpose of climate policy, climate adaptation and mitigation? Is there north-south climate financing or south-south climate financing? Have international financial institutions been reformed, or are they much the same as they are today? And we have another cluster about national political dynamics. So who's ruling in which countries around the world, especially with a focus on Germany, because we were in Germany and that interested us. So in 2030, who's governing in Germany? Who's in charge in the US? Are there stable governments in different countries in the EU and around the world? Or are there clear majorities, or are they relatively minority governments that have trouble pushing through policies that they are interested in? And to what extent has there been a right-wing swing in many countries in Europe, which at the time when we were doing this exercise seemed very, very likely, and it continues to seem quite likely in many countries in Europe at the moment. Then we have one on the international institutional landscape. So what's happening with the Paris Agreement, what's happening in the UNFCCC, are SDGs being implemented? Are there different types of climate clubs in place? What role does the World Trade Organization play? How legitimate is the International Panel on Climate Change? And so forth. Then we have two clusters that are more about social and political perception dynamics. So under social constraints and drivers, we have social acceptance of certain climate relevant measures, public support for climate policy, the extent to which there are success stories about just transitions, the way in which communication about climate change has developed, and the perception of progress on just transitions. And the same thing under the political perception. So this is not just about societal perceptions, but political perceptions of progress on climate. So how viable does the 1.5 degree target seem in 2030? What is the political perception of climate impacts in different countries around the world? What is the perception of how far off track or on track we are among political actors around the world? So that's a run through of the factors that we gathered, covering many levels of policy making. And these factors could present both opportunities and risks to climate policy, depending on how they develop in the future. So their future trajectories or projections. So just mapping these factors that could have an influence on climate policy in the future was already a really useful exercise for us, but we wanted to take it a step further and think about how exactly these factors might develop in the future. But to do this, we needed to choose some key factors to continue to work with because there were too many. It's a very complex space. We couldn't do projections for all of these factors. So following this first really wide collection of factors, we conducted a simplified, what's called an uncertainty impact analysis to collect key uncertainties. Key uncertainties are factors that, in the participants' collective opinion, could have a very high potential impact on the future of climate policy and whose plausible future outcomes have a significant range or spread, meaning their outcomes are very uncertain. So we can't predict or assume that we know how they're going to develop in the future. There's this opening of the future cone, as I mentioned before. So using different colored stickers in the workshop, I asked the participants, we had this big board with all of the factors on them. I asked the participants to indicate which of the factors gathered during the horizon scanning exercise that they considered both highly impactful and potentially highly uncertain. So following several rounds of discussions, based on this ranking, the participants agreed upon seven highly ranked key uncertainties to continue to work with, which you can see here. So these are taken from this big board where we had all of the slide that I showed you before with all of the factors that could potentially be relevant. We identified these seven key uncertainties. So the first one is who's in charge, who's governing in different countries around the world. Is it more climate friendly parties or climate anti-climate parties? Then we have the second key uncertainty is techno-economic advancements. So in hydrogen, CCS, carbon removal, renewable energy technologies, to what extent are they advancing? Then we have key uncertainty 3, which is to what extent do we have non-climate crises like health issues, pandemics, or economic problems in the future. Then we have key uncertainty 4 is the extent of geopolitical rivalries and or alliances, US-China or Russia versus the West in this future world. Then number 5 is international climate governance mechanisms in this future. Does the Paris Agreement work as intended, and does it guide national policy making or not? Then we have the level of private sector investment and the availability of climate finance in this future. And finally, the political perception of progress on climate in this imagined future. How much do people consider we are off track? What emissions trajectories seem likely? And what climate impacts are being perceived in this future? So now we had identified this set of factors that we all thought would have a significant effect on climate policy in the future. But the question is, what sort of effect might they have? This depends on how these factors might develop in the future, their trajectories or projections. And for this activity, I asked the participants to try to imagine at least 3 possible outcomes for each factor in 2030. And these outcomes should be mutually exclusive and comprehensively exhaustive. That means they don't overlap, but you can imagine they fill the whole range of plausible outcomes within this future cone. So, and we asked them to not think about likely future states of their factor, because that's just extrapolation, but to come up with a wide range of plausible future states of each factor. And you can see the resulting sets of factor projections here. So each of the key uncertainties that I just introduced to you is listed on the left, and 3 projections of how that factor could develop in 2030 are listed in the other columns. So as an example, the one at the top, so that's who's in charge in different countries around the world. Projection A is that only pro-climate parties, or the good guys from our perspective, are in power in different countries around the world. Projection B is the opposite, only anti-climate parties are in power. And projection C is there's a colorful mixture of pro and anti-climate parties in power, but we said there might be a slight pro-climate improvement over time. with technological advancements one level down. So we said projection A is that there are rapid breakthroughs and upscaling of all climate relevant technologies. So renewables, hydrogen, CCS, carbon dioxide removal approaches. Projection B is the opposite, the stagnation of all climate relevant technology, possibly due to increased cost or lack of political will. And projection C is incremental but differentiated progress across different technologies. So there might be some progress on renewables, but other types of technologies might not progress. So I won't go through all of them, but you get the idea. So we have each of the key uncertainties on the left, and then different projections of how this factor might develop in the future as you move to the right. So now we had a set of factors that we thought would have a significant influence on EU climate policy in the future, and a set of projections for how these factors might develop in the future. But we wanted also to think through the possible interdependencies and interactions between these factors. And to do this in a structured way, we then created a set of 3 scenario frameworks. And each scenario framework included one projection from each of the key uncertainties, this table that I just showed you. And of course, there are a huge range of possible scenario frameworks if you try and connect these different projections together. But not all of them are conceptually consistent. Certain projections could just not fit together. If you think there's only pro-climate parties in power and absolutely no action on climate, how does that fit together? You have to argue and think logically to find which projections fit consistently with each other. The aim of this exercise, therefore, was to identify logically consistent scenario frameworks, how these different projections could fit together. And given the relatively small size of our group that was undertaking this exercise, we were only 6 people, and the number of projections involved, we did this via group discussion. It's also possible to do this with a computer-aided tool where everyone ranks the level of consistency between all, like it's a cross table, and everyone ranks the consistency of all different projections, and then the computer-aided analysis would help to identify conceptually consistent packages of factors. But in this case, we did it in a deliberative way. We did it via group discussion, and we were able to reach consensus on which projections we thought were logically consistent and could paint plausible pictures of the future. And you can see the factor projections that we grouped together to form 3 scenario frameworks color-coded here. So there's the blue scenario going from the top to the bottom. There's the yellow scenario going from the top to bottom, and there's the red scenario going from the top to the bottom. And these are 3 challenging futures that EU climate policy decision makers might face in 2030. So the blue scenario, which we sort of half-jokingly called good guys in a bad world, involves climate policy under polycrisis. Multiple crises are ongoing. There's rivalries blocking action. Too little is happening too late, despite the best efforts of pro-climate parties. So you can have a read through of the different projections. So there's only pro-climate parties in power. There's stagnation of all climate relevant technology. There's global systemic instability and multiple ongoing crises. There's dysfunctional rivalries blocking action and blocking alignment on climate policy. There's a sort of race to the bottom. There's fragmented climate policy. Key decisions are being taken outside the Paris Agreement. There's what we called claiming and shining rather than naming and shaming. It's the opposite. So claiming and shining involves making promises but actually not doing anything. And there's a very thin layer of universal implementation of climate policy through nationally determined contributions being updated, but not much action is being taken. And then we had a very limited private sector financing, some public green investment, but mostly greenwashing. The public perception of progress on climate is that there's too little happening too late. Emissions are still rising. climate impacts are deemed very serious globally. There's a perception of climate failure, especially related to mitigation failure. So that's the blue scenario. Then we have the yellow scenario. We called this a brave new green tech world. It's a very mixed picture, sort of a techno-optimist dystopia. So there's technological breakthroughs, but this is not everything. There are no silver bullets. So it didn't 100% work the way that tech optimists might hope. So it's a colorful mixture of pro and anti-climate parties in power. There's breakthrough and rapid upscaling of all climate relevant technology. There's stability in the world, no crises. There's fragmentation among geopolitical rivalries, some alignment, but differentiated by policy fields. The Paris Agreement is considered irrelevant. High emitting countries have dropped out, but there's still action happening to a certain extent. Then there's public finance is aligned with climate targets. Green investment becomes a business model globally. So there's a lot of investment in green tech, but there's incremental change. Some progress perceived by political perception by some, but not enough to achieve climate goals or prevent climate impacts. So it's sort of a mixed world. And then we have the red scenario, which we called less is more, market for climate. It's a sort of uncomfortable scenario. There's a neoliberal backlash. There's competitive optimization in a pretty negative looking world. So we had to, this was one that sort of emerged during discussion. It wasn't part of the original set, but it's one that developed during discussion. So only climate agnostic parties are ruling. That means that they're not pro or anti-climate, but they don't really have a position on it. Then there's incremental but differentiated progress across different technologies. There's regional, sporadic, time-bound crises, but rivalries are driving competitive action and alignment. So actually, competition is working out here. The countries are not working together, but at the same time, they want to outdo each other. So there's a race to the top on climate in action in some spaces. There's only carbon market mechanisms implemented. It's sort of a economic optimization and market-based governance rather than regulatory standards. There's no public financing, only private. And when it comes to the political perception of progress on climate, there's stagnation, no real progress on preventing climate change, but also no perceived negative climate impact. So the perception of what's happening in climate is kind of stagnant. It's not moving. So these are three complex, challenging futures that climate policy decision makers might face in 2030. Not necessarily probable futures. I want to say that we're not able to predict the future, but we would say they are plausible futures. We could imagine a world that looks like each of these scenarios. And the participants were then asked to flesh out their scenario frameworks because these were just very basic building blocks. And they did this in breakout groups, one group for each scenario. And they first created a set of newspaper headlines that described a coherent picture of that future based on the projections in their respective scenario framework. And then they were asked to create a history or trajectory that could plausibly lead to the situation they describe. And this was done by conducting a backcasting exercise and creating timelines of key events that lead to each future. And they were also asked to identify key dynamics driving change in their narratives. So the result of such a process was then the set of qualitative scenarios that not only provide a range of detailed pictures of plausible futures, but also included a rich history of each future, a pathway that describes the key technological, economic, political, and social changes that would have to happen between today and that imagined future. And I don't have time to show you the results of all the scenarios today, but I would like to show you one of them, one that I find personally quite interesting, and that's the blue scenario. So here you can see on the far right, the newspaper headlines that the participants created to help describe what is happening in the imagined future of this blue scenario. So this is just to give a little bit more detail. So the headline the headlines in 2030 about who's in charge say that Trump's anti-climate legacy in the US makes new climate-first approach of the Democrats difficult. The second green wave lacks teeth in Germany as economy and investment stagnates. And global polycrisis hamstrings Green's ambitions. So we try to, make these quite catchy. They're sort of newspaper headlines. And then when it comes to techno-economic advancements, how green tech lost its shine. Slow ramp up has killed hydrogen hype, and expense has made people reluctant to switch to renewables. Carbon capture and storage is an investment graveyard. Tech optimism might not save us from climate change after all. When it comes to non-climate crises, the headline is Economic Progress Stalled Globally. Planetary Polycrisis Paralyzes Global Trade. Geopolitical rivalries. No one thought discoupling would go this way. A slippery slope into deglobalization. The return of the mercantile state. Then when it comes to international climate governance, the headlines are that international climate politics is at a stalemate, all hot air and no action, or little action. National leaders try to outshine each other with promises, but don't follow through. NDC implementation gap widening by the year. And Paris was supposed to be the beginning, not the end. And when it comes to availability of public financing, the headlines are, the price is not right. The private sector turns away from green tech. Government investments de-risk greenwashing rather than de-risking green transformation. And when it comes to political progress, perception of progress, the headlines are too little, too late. Recent survey shows public belief in mitigation at an all-time low. No one believes we can achieve Paris Agreement temperature targets anymore. And this adapt is on. Now is the time to invest in adapting to the inevitable. So these are, sort of trying to encourage creating a more detailed picture of this future by creating newspaper headlines. And I hope that gave you a bit of an overview over this future. So good pro-climate parties are in power, but very little is happening on climate due to other things happening in the world. And here you can see a rough timeline, a chronological sequence of key events that the participants came up with that could lead to the picture of the future described in these newspaper headlines. So starting from, because we were doing this in 2024 at the beginning of last year, so we didn't know the outcome of the European elections or the American elections at this time. But it turns out we were not wrong. So in 2024, we thought that we put in this scenario that the EU elections, that von der Leyen would win and that climate policy would become more symbolic in the next phase of EU policy. We thought that in 2024, Trump is elected, leaves the Paris Agreement, initiates rollback of climate and carbon management policies, that in 2025, negotiations around loss and damage and other things at COP29 fail. In the 2025 German elections, there would be a green CDU coalition winning and similar governments in other EU countries. This, we'll see how plausible that is later this year. Then also in 2025, we said that EIA, International Energy Agency, projections of the speed up of carbon capture and storage were downgraded. We said that Saudi Arabia's, this was just an example, a state, not necessarily Saudi Arabia, but a large oil state's nationally determined contribution for COP30 includes Tanzania's forest, meaning that a lot of carbon trading is happening. So people are continuing to emit in high fossil fuel dependent societies and offsetting their emissions by paying other countries for removal potential of their land. Then in 2026, we said Trump blocks renewable energy exports from China due to increased tensions with China. And in retaliation, China bans exports of rare earths, so critical minerals that are necessary for the production of batteries, for example, and other climate relevant technologies. And due to these blockages and other countries also being affected, a global recession begins because trade is made more difficult. There's blockades in the South China Sea, and tensions between China and other countries in that region become worse. There's an escalation of climate and economic refugee crises in the EU, the US, and Asia. Then in 2029, something positive happens. Democrats are re-elected in the US, but as we remembered from the newspaper headlines, the Trump legacy makes it very difficult for them to progress. And in 2030, the tripling of the renewables target for 2030 is not reached. So things are looking quite, not looking great on the climate front. And here, finally, these are the main drivers of the developments in this scenario that the participants identified. So I asked them, what are the core dynamics underlying changes in the scenario? What creates the interconnections between the events in the scenario? And they said it's global economic and geopolitical feedback dynamics, structuring domestic politics, reducing the agency of green elected leaders in Europe and elsewhere. But there's nationalism surging as a reaction to broader geopolitical developments. Again, national developments are conditioned by international dynamics. Technology is not a key driver of climate policy due to economic downturn and geopolitical obstruction. And there's a breakdown of perception in the international ability to meet climate targets and a shift towards adaptation. So in the next step, each group then presented their scenario to the larger group. So this was the development of the scenarios were done in breakout groups, but then we had collective feedback rounds and joint discussion, so that we tried to get away from individual biases through structured group communication to improve the consistency of the scenarios. And the participants were asked to discuss where were the strategic decision points on the scenario pathway, and what types of policy decisions could have been made to address the opportunities and risks presented in the scenario. So here you can see the two main strategic decision points that the participants identified on the scenario pathway. The first key decision point comes in 2025, when the EU and Germany just have to decide whether to follow the global trend of subordinating climate goals. And the second pivotal moment comes in 2026, when the EU has a choice of how to react to the US sanctions on Chinese green technology. So all of the participants agreed that the hypothetical decisions made in the scenario at these two pivotal points had a huge effect on the further development of the narrative. And had different policy choices been made at those times, the scenario would have developed very differently. So they are pivotal decision points. And in response to the question, what types of policy decisions could have been made to address the opportunities and risks presented in the scenarios, the participants gathered concrete examples of opportunities and risks presented by each scenario. And these are opportunities and risks presented to EU decision makers. So they're very specific to the people in the room. If you ask different people to identify opportunities and risks in a scenario, for example, an oil company or a gas company, they would identify very different risks and opportunities. So it's always very subjective. But these are the opportunities and risks from the perspective of the EU decision makers. This is from the blue scenario again. So the opportunities are the green circles. The risks are the beige circles, and the blue circles are potential policy responses in reaction to these opportunities and risks. So I won't go through all of them, but you can see some of the opportunities that were presented is that the green so there's a silent greening of European administrations. So because some green parties are involved in government, although there's not a lot of change in policy, at least there's a lot of green people in administration, and the way that the blue circle above this at the top of the box there is a way in which there could be a policy response, could be an incremental administrative-led change out of the political spotlight. So sort of doing more of, as often happens in Germany, behind the scenes, sort of incremental change to rules that lead to more green policies or green regulations being implemented without it having to happen on the political stage. Then we have the renewable energy industry in Europe. It's an opportunity, given that trade is blocking import of green tech from other countries, especially from China, which is where we get a lot of it from now. So the renewable energy industry in Europe might have to strengthen because it's not able to trade. So and the blue circle that's associated with that is that the policymakers could establish strong opportunities narrative around green tech in Europe. So let's establish new jobs, create new jobs, and become a powerhouse for green tech in Europe. So that's some examples of opportunities and the ways in which policy responses or also societal responses could, capitalize on these opportunities. And then on the other side, we've got some risks in the beige color or yellow color that you've got here. So one that we've got here is energy security. So it's a big risk if you're not able to trade as much, not able to have as much import of green tech or the components needed for green tech. Then some responses to this could be energy demand reduction or capitalizing on energy independence as a major objective of climate policy, and that's linked to the job creation opportunity that we have on the other side. So those are some of the key, the way that we can think through in a structured way some of the risks and opportunities presented by a given picture of the future, and then think through responses to them that could help take advantage of the opportunities and counterbalance the risks. Okay, and during the final step of the scenario workshop, the participants were invited to engage in a sort of comparative reflection process. This was designed to broaden the analytical lens to include all of the scenarios. So what I showed you just now was focused on one scenario, but this final step was sort of to look across all the scenarios. So I asked the participants to reflect upon and discuss these two questions. What are the key context conditions driving policy developments across all scenarios? Are there similarities or differences? And what types of policy developments could help address opportunities and risks presented across all the scenarios? So this is about thinking about robust ways of dealing with a really wide range of risks and opportunities. And here are the three key risks we identified in our scenarios for achieving a climate neutral Europe. So the outcome of national elections will play a key role for climate policy. A conservative right shift make climate policy less of a priority in many countries around the world. And after the 2024 elections on the EU level, the EU Commission and many EU member states may no longer put the green transformation front and center. And unfortunately, this has come to pass after the elections. And international climate governance and negotiations may fail to drive global mitigation efforts fast enough. So these are risks that turned up across all the scenarios. And these are the recommendations that we identified that could help EU decision makers address the risks that emerged across the scenarios. First of all, work out the climate policy role of the EU in the US-China relationship. If there is a stalemate on climate between US and China, the EU might be able to take a stronger leadership role. Secondly, develop EU green tech diplomacy. European green industry and green industrial policy development could create new narratives around the Green Deal, establishing tech transfer partnerships with emerging economies and so forth, was seen as a promising way to position the EU in a range of plausible futures. Thirdly, emphasizing co-benefit narratives of climate policy. So not talking about climate for climate's sake in a world where there's increasing geopolitical and economic focus of policy. Emphasize co-benefits, employment, energy and human security, and so forth. Then further develop the adaptation discussion in the EU and globally. If mitigation doesn't move fast enough to prevent dangerous climate effects, there will be a need to think about what an EU adaptation strategy might look like, or what the EU's climate policy priorities and partnerships how they might change if the focus shifts to adaptation rather than mitigation in the future. And finally, recognizing emerging economies as important climate actors. The EU should think more about what role Brazil, India, and others might play in future climate policy, and how the EU can work with them to achieve common goals. I'm coming to the end of my time. I see that I've been talking for 43 minutes. I think I had 45 maximum. So to summarize and recap, here are a few key takeaways from my talk today. Climate policy is a multifaceted field characterized by complex interplay between domestic, regional, and international dynamics. Thinking through the possible future complexities of climate policy therefore requires an approach that considers these complex interconnections, and foresight and qualitative scenario development can help anticipate interactions between a range of political, economic, technological, and social factors that can and will play a role in multi-level climate futures and in achieving climate neutrality in Europe, hopefully. And with that, I would say thank you. And if you're interested, you can read more about the different scenarios and our recommendations for how to navigate them in our working paper, which is freely available online. You will get the slides afterwards, and this link leads you directly to this paper. And I would say thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Miranda. It was a very interesting talk. I very much enjoyed reading the paper. It was very insightful methodology. Let's go into the questions right away. We have one question is, what made you pair only pro-climate parties rule with technological advances slow due to high costs, etc.? I find it interesting how politically the most climate optimistic scenario in your model eventually leads to quite a dire situation.
Yeah, so we wanted to not just think about likely probable scenarios, we wanted to make them interesting. So I think this is sort of a, like, how can we expand the future cone by thinking about unexpected connections. So yeah, I mean, I also, at the end, we also have a reflection on this in the paper, where we realize that we're quite negative, because this was also a self-reflection process among the members of the climate research cluster at the SWP. We realized we're actually quite negative, Like, we don't have a rosy future in our scenario set. It might say something about us rather than about how the world really works. But yeah, so we wanted to maybe make a move beyond sort of the extrapolation of what we would like to see happen, or what seems most likely, and sort of make it a little bit broader. I think that's why it ended up that way.
Maybe the researchers are the most pessimistic.
Unfortunately, you might be right.
So next question, could you please elaborate a bit how to select the blue or other colors scenarios from the 4 predictions?
So in this case, we did it in a really deliberative manner. No? So I, as the moderator, picked someone from the group to choose a starting point in this table. It could be anywhere. It didn't have to be at the top or the bottom. It could be any projection that they found interesting. And then I went around the room and picked another person to choose the next projection and argue why they thought it was consistent with the previous projection that was chosen by the original person. And they had to convince others. Like others could say, oh, I don't think that's plausibly, I don't think it's consistent. Like that doesn't make sense. I would prefer this other projection fit together. And it went backwards and forwards until there was a consensus basically on which of these projections fit together plausibly. So this is one way of doing it in a very deliberative manner. Another way, which is more even more structured but potentially less insightful because you don't learn from each other as much, is you go with an assessment tool, which basically is a cross table of all the factor projections and how they could potentially interact. You get everyone to input their scores on a scale of 1 to 5, how consistent they find projection A from key uncertainty 1 and with projection C of key uncertainty 5, right? So all of them, all interactions have to be given a numerical score by everyone involved, and then you have a program that helps to then compute the consistency of based on all the averages of all the scores. Yeah, so you can do it like this, and then you end up with statistically or mathematically consistent factor projection sets. Then you still have to discuss these with the participants, right? Because it could be that the mathematical consistency analysis spits out something where people are like, huh? What? Why? And then you have to talk through it and then choose which ones you want to work with. So those are the two ways of doing this consistency analysis.
Thank you very much. Actually, like related to a couple of notes that I wrote down for myself, for example, like how when you identified those key uncertainties, how would they interact or exacerbate one another, whether you kind of accounted for that in your selection?
Not in the selection, but definitely during the uncertainty impact, the consistency analysis, right? So when we were selecting the factors themselves, we were only thinking about them in isolation. How significant how strong could their impact be? And how uncertain could their range be? We were thinking of them in isolation. But then when you get to the consistency analysis, then you start thinking about the interactions between the different the factors and how they influence each other.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question. So this is a very classical but well-structured way of scenario building. Did you face resistance within your group of participants to follow? So what are you intending to do with the scenario? So let's start with the first one. Did you have some resistance within the group?
Not in this group, because they are my colleagues and they like what I do, and there was buy-in already from the group. They asked me to help them think through these things. So it was very different to other scenario processes that I have facilitated where you do face resistance. So I work quite a lot with in other projects with natural scientists or people from administrative bodies or people from ministries who think this is a little bit unserious or maybe not a very academic way of thinking or working. So yes, I have faced resistance to this before, but generally only at the beginning of the process. When you're introducing the process, people question the process and say, I don't really want to be here. But once they get into it, right, and they start realizing they can bring in their assumptions and their academic know-how or their practical know-how from an administrative perspective or a regulatory perspective into understanding or thinking about plausible futures, then they realize and they start learning from others about, for example, from a climate scientist about potential I don't know, climate feedback effects on certain ecosystems, or learning from an economist about effects of certain monetary policy changes that they didn't really know before. And then so it starts becoming very detailed very quickly, and then people start engaging much more and realizing, oh, yeah, I need to bring in my expertise so that other people can better understand why what they think about the future isn't right. So I think, yeah, there is some resistance among some people, depending on the group of people in the room and who requested the scenario exercise be conducted. No? Sometimes it's organizations where a leader has said, okay, we need to do this. And the people, and then they bring in other department heads or something who haven't signed up, like they don't feel they want to, but they have to because someone told them to, then that's very difficult. But once you get past that initial resistance and really get people engaged, they really enjoy it, actually. And I have never had a scenario process where at the end there was someone who was still like, oh, this was a waste of time. So that's, I think it really engages people.
Well, thank you.
Oh, and what to do with the scenarios. Yeah. So in this case, it was kind of an inward facing process, actually. We were trying to use this to think about how we think about climate futures as a group. No? At the people at the SWP, we are a climate cluster. We all work in different departments, but we all work on climate, and we wanted to, as a group, reflect on the way that we think about climate futures. And so it was mostly as an internal exercise, so we weren't planning to publish them. But after we developed the scenarios, and in the paper, we also reflect upon what it taught us about our gaps and, you know, what our blind spots, what we don't think about. Well, we didn't think about social movements at all. None of us thought that Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future would play a role. That didn't turn up. Why? And things like this. So after we did this internal reflection process and documented it, we were like, well, maybe some other people can learn from this in a way. So we just did a working paper and put it online. Apart from that, we're not planning to do anything.
I actually think this is actually a response to the next question. I think you answered that question already. So the next question is, it strikes me that climate change and biodiversity loss impacts are rather absent from these scenarios, as well as the implications on the global south, for example, climate migration, climate and biodiversity scenarios, etc. So I think that's probably why.
Yes, and this was something that we also reflected upon. Huh? So we did have climate migration, was in one of the scenarios quite strongly. But we didn't have biodiversity issues explicitly in there. No? And this is obviously a blind spot. I mean, we are all climate policy people. But we should be thinking about these things because they're intrinsically connected, right? So this really shone a spotlight on that for us. And since then, we have been talking more to biodiversity people, and hopefully this will help us learn from recognizing our biases.
Okay. So the last question in the chat, and then maybe I have some time to get to my questions. So do you think that US has anti-climate legacy policy, some sustainable carbon cycles of Paris Agreement, and should compare to several green investments in EU and China or not?
Again, I'm not sure I understood.
It's like, I think I'm also not quite sure I understand the question. Do you think that US has anti-climate legacy policy and should compare to several green investments in EU and China or not? So if Professor Hansa Watananuki is there, could you please maybe rephrase your question? I'm not quite sure I understand that, but maybe you can start with the first half. So does US have an anti-climate legacy policy?
Not yet, but I assume after Trump's done, it will. So this was an extrapolation, right? So we were talking about in 2030, after Trump 2.0, the US will have a bad climate legacy policy in comparison to the current state. I mean, at the moment, it's not too bad because Biden did do quite some progressive things while he was in power. But I think we can safely assume that Trump is going to undo at least some of that. So that was the assumption that we were making in making that statement.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, we are pretty much out of time now, but I mean, afterwards we can share some insights further. So I'm very much looking forward to have the chance to maybe cooperate with you in the future. Thank you very much. It's been very insightful, very interesting study. And thank you very much for getting up so early for us.
That's okay.
Very much appreciated. And so thank you very much, everyone, for participating and for all of your questions. We will put the recording and the slides up on our project website. And with that, I'd like to end today's session. And thank you again, Miranda, and have a good afternoon and good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.